So anyway, as I was saying, welcome to this event in our One Book, One Community series. We have been doing programs since the middle of January, and you can see recordings of all of those if you go to the library's One Book page, which is wrl.org/onebook. Tonight we're going to be talking about sort of the other end of our beginning program, which was an introduction to racial trauma. And tonight we're going to be talking about healing from racial trauma. There have been any number of studies that are bringing the current effects and even some both cultural and possibly even genetic effects of ongoing racism within communities that are affected. And there is a strong need for people to learn how to not just stop accepting racism, but also to start healing themselves. And hopefully, once they, I think, Amanda, you told me once they heal themselves, they can start healing the world. So our speaker tonight is Amanda Lynch. Amanda works with the Greater Richmond Stop Child Abuse Network, or SCAN, where she is the trauma-informed specialist embedded in the Boys and Girls Clubs of Metro Richmond. During her 20 years in education, she focused on supporting her students, which led her to seeking more information about substance use disorder, cultural responsiveness, and historical trauma. She began practicing yoga in 2013 and became passionate about bringing restorative yoga, and meditation to underserved populations. Amanda is the author of 4 books aimed at teaching adults and children restorative practices, forgiveness and healing, and mindfulness. So Amanda, please share with us how we can help ourselves and how others.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm always surprised when people read things about me because, I'm just very humble about all of the hats that I wear. And so I thought we would talk a little bit this evening. So I'm a yoga and meditation teacher, and so within every training that I give, more often than not, we will also do some practices so that you have something very practical to walk away with. And so I wanted to just jump in. I know you had an overview of what racial trauma was. I'm going to share these slides with you, Andrew, for anyone who might be interested. Amy and I will sometimes give this workshops together, so her name is still here. But that way you all will have this information should you want to share it with anyone in an organization you might be here representing, or just want to share it in general. So there will be some things that there's a video in the beginning that I think I'll just skip over, but that you can watch in your own time. It's only about 4 minutes long, but I really want to honor the time that we have here and leave plenty of room for questions. And so we'll talk about trauma, racial trauma being one of the trauma indicators, but I want you to walk away with understanding the complex nature of trauma, which includes epigenetics and then historical trauma. And then we'll talk a little bit about how it might impact brain development, and then really talking about resilience and how to build that within yourself and then those you serve. One thing for me is that when I talk about self-healing, I always want to refill my own cup so that everything that's in that overflow, I can give out to other people. So once I've poured enough self-healing practices into myself, it allows me to be able to offer that as a gift to my family, to my community, my coworkers, whoever. And so we'll talk about that as well. So I thought we would do a quick breath practice. And this is something that you can certainly do on your own time. I have 4 children, and about 1 million jobs. And so sometimes I will just sneak away for 2 or 3 minutes to just breathe. And so we'll do a breathwork practice, which is really just finding your breath. So I invite you, wherever you are seated, to come to a tall seated position. bringing your shoulders back and chest forward. I invite you to close your eyes if that's available to you today. If not, simply find somewhere to fix your gaze. Maybe that's the tip of your nose or at your feet. And take a moment to just notice the natural rhythm of your breath, not straining or working too hard, just noticing your breath right where you are. Soften your face, relax your jaw. Lower your tongue away from the roof of your mouth. And notice how you're feeling right where you are. Notice what you feel and where you're holding this feeling in your body. Some of us may be excited to learn new information. Others may be tired from a long day. Take a moment to release anything that is not serving you well today. Anything that may pose as a distraction or prevent you from fully showing up for yourself and as your best self this evening. Take a few more very deep, cleansing breaths. Breathing in deeply on your inhale and breathing out fully on your exhale. Opening your eyes when you're ready. Thank you for allowing me to lead you through a short practice this evening. I like to start that way because many of us are transitioning from time with our families or maybe being pulled away from dinner or work. And so I find that just taking a moment to sit and breathe is just a nice way to transition. And so in the chat, let's just check in how you're feeling, 1 being the worst and 10 being the best. And you can also offer a feeling or word or words to describe how you're feeling in this moment. And so for me, I'm a little anxious and hoping that my girls are tucked safely in bed and that they won't pop in as they tend to do. Just take a moment to check in with yourself. And while you're doing that, we'll talk just a little bit about what trauma is, which also includes racial trauma, of course. Trauma results from an event, series of event, or set of circumstances that are experienced by an individual, right? This could be something that is perceived or real. It can be physical, emotional, or harmful, or life-threatening event, but it tends to have a lasting or adverse effect on a person's functioning, whether that's mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual. Now, something that could happen to me could also happen to Andrew, and one of us walk away completely unfazed, right? So last week, I was in a bit of a fender bender. My youngest daughter was in her car seat. I was driving. The way that she perceived that incident was very different than myself. She walked away, not really bothered. But it was something that really caused me to have a lot of anxiety. And so just recognizing that as well, that two people or groups of people may experience the same event, but it have a very, very different effect. Trauma is very subjective. There's several types: acute, chronic, and complex. So acute, a single event, that car accident, for example, something that just happened in a very limited time. Chronic could be something that happens over and over again. It could be something that's happening over a long period of time. When I was a classroom teacher, I worked in Richmond City for most of my 20 years working in public education. Many of my students had been impacted by community and sometimes domestic violence, right? So that was something that was chronic. But that can also turn into complex trauma. It can be, separate, but it can also be ongoing. And so thinking about the way that it may impact a child or even your own sense of safety and self-worth. And so in the chat, just drop what you think some possible traumatic experiences might be. So I'll drop in the one we're here to talk about tonight. That's racism, divorce and death, loss of parents. I mentioned a car accident, physical harm. You guys are giving really great answers. Prolonged sickness or any sickness really. I think that the situation with COVID has certainly been traumatic for most people. So some additional traumatic events might include natural and man-made disasters, deployments, homelessness, being displaced, substance use disorder, whether it's personal, a friend or family member's use, vicarious trauma. And so that was something else as a classroom teacher. Things would happen in the community and sometimes it would feed over into me. I would pick that up almost like secondary trauma. So we're going to skip this video. We'll skip this. It's about 4 minutes long, and it just really goes more into that understanding racial trauma definition that those of you who attended the presentation earlier this week probably got some of that information, which is why we're going to skip it. And now to talk about historical and systemic trauma. And so this is something that I learned maybe 5 years ago, that the trauma of my ancestors could be passed down to me, right? So there was an experiment that was done many years ago in China, maybe 20 years or so ago, with rats. And they were introduced to the smell of cherry blossoms. But when that smell was sent into their cage, something very shocking happened to them, whether it was electric shock or being deprived from food, but there was something that happened to them. So when those mama rats had their pups, the pups were removed from them. They never had a negative experience with the smell of cherry blossoms. But when that smell was introduced to them, they immediately became frightened, right? And so trauma can sort of flip a switch within your genetic code. And scientists believe that this is just a part of our survival mechanism, right? And so that trauma not only alters the person's behavior who is directly experiencing it, but it can also change the DNA of and genes of your, the kids that come behind you, the future generations. So when we look at that experience with rats, for example, they had high cortisol levels, which affected their hippocampus. Um, the part of their brain where thinking and memory was most profound, which shrunk. They had impairments in learning, memory, and mood. And then looking at people who have experienced racism, they can sometimes have a chronic low-grade fever, right? So almost like having a low fever all the time. So your temperature is, hovering around 100 all the time, right? And so thinking how that will also dysregulate your genes. It can also make you at a higher risk of having high blood pressure, a heart attack, or stroke. And then also there's been correlations with advanced aging, subtle alterations we just mentioned on your genetic code. And you can also have PTSD-like symptoms when you have experienced racism over a period of time. And that can range from anxiety to anger to hypervigilance. I can tell you that when all of the things were going on last summer, I was having dreams about what happened to George Floyd because watching that footage over and over and over, not with George Floyd, but Philando Castile and Tamir Rice and so on, started to impact my sleeping. And so your sleep can also be disrupted. You might also overeat. So all of those things that we tend to do when we are facing toxic stress can also happen when we are having racist encounters. And so again, looking at epigenetics, you look at this picture on the right, it shows grandma, grandma is smoking. There's a good percentage of people who smoke who do that because of anxiety. It's up in the 80s. And so she's smoking, and you can see her baby, that's mom in the middle. Mom is being impacted certainly by the cigarette smoke, but you can also see the grandchild, who's that little blue dot in grandma's belly, who will also be impacted. So a woman who smokes while pregnant induces those epigenetic changes we just talked about in 3 generations at once. So we're looking at herself, her unborn daughter, and then also her daughter's reproductive cells, right? So epigenetic exposures can be impacted by unhealthy eating, by substance abuse, financial issues, smoking, intravenous drug use. Some of these things are can be lifelong outcomes of having very elevated adverse childhood experiences, which we'll talk about as well. And so, looking at just having a trauma-informed approach, I just think that this is best practice across the board, whether we're talking about racial trauma or community violence. A lot of the responses tend to be the same. And so we want to look at realizing how widespread trauma, racial trauma are, but also understanding that there's a path for recovery, which leads to resilience. Also recognizing those signs and symptoms about racial trauma that might exist if you are a clinician with working with clients in schools, wherever in the community that you come in contact with families or staff or anyone that you are involved with. But then finding ways to respond appropriately to persons who have been impacted by trauma, and then resisting that re-traumatization, especially with children, because sometimes we will we'll find out something has happened, and we'll have a young person repeat that story 10 times, and that can also be an act of re-traumatization. So again, looking at realizing, understanding behaviors, providing some coping strategies. When I work with kids, I talk about putting tools in their toolkit. I do this with adults too, but kids get really enthused about being able to put tools in their toolkit. Understanding that trauma and racism have a deep impact on mental health and substance use disorder. Looking at the brain, our brain develops what it needs to survive. And so our brain develops from bottom to top. And so a lot of times, and the only thing in our brain that's fully developed when we're born is our brainstem, which controls all those life functioning things like breathing. But our brain develops through experiences. And so that survival or primitive part of our brain is what develops first, right? So being able to scan your environment and knowing that you're safe is very important to a baby. If a baby is crying and someone comes and picks the baby up, that person becomes a signal for safety. And so if that doesn't happen, that downstairs part of your brain can be overdeveloped, right? So your brain is designed to survive the world that you live in. And so looking at a healthy brain at the top is what we would all hope to have. But then down at the bottom, you notice that those neural pathways are very thin. And so when your brain has been exposed to trauma, those neural pathways don't always connect. And again, look at a normal brain on the left versus a child who's been in an orphanage who has an extremely neglected brain. You notice that the ventricles in the middle are very large. The brain matter on the white matter on the outside of the brain is thin and shrunken. So being able to do those higher level functioning skills that we will sometimes ask of coworkers or colleagues or children They just might not have access to those tools, and it could lead back to trauma. Again, what might appear as a poor behavior could actually be a survival skill, right? And so we are using the brain um, that has been adapted to survive in certain environments, right? So really understanding if persons are having a brain-based issue versus a behavior problem. For those of you, I'm not sure, how familiar you all are with the ACE study, but many years ago, I think 1992, two researchers from the CDC, Dr. Vincent Folletti and Dr. Anda, um, came up with an ACE questionnaire, right? Sort of stumbled upon it. One doctor was studying heart disease and another was studying obesity. But they noticed within their patients that there were a lot of areas of similarity. And so on that ACE study, racism is not something that is mentioned, but it doesn't mean that it's not a trauma indicator, most certainly. And so the more trauma that you pour into someone, the more likely they may be to develop certain lifelong health issues, whether it's from promiscuity, uh, dropping out of school, which might lead to poor job opportunities, which might lead to substance abuse, neglect of one's children, uh, diabetes, cancer, a host of other disability and societal problems. And so, really understanding that racism and having that be a prolonged experience can also set someone up on the same trajectory. It can also make you question whether you should be here, whether you are, your own self-worth, whether you're smart enough to do something, like go to college even. And so just recognizing that racism is a public health crisis um, and setting up environments to support those who are working to actively be anti-racist, but those who also may be experiencing racism. Okay, and that goes into recognize understanding again that there are three different types of racism: structural, institutional, and individual, right? And so looking at those levels and types, whether it's a person's personal or private beliefs, interpersonal, so something you share with someone, those institutional practices that we sometimes see that we might not even know are racist. So I'll give you an example. I'm not sure if you all saw over the summer the two ballerinas on point standing on top of the Robert E. Lee Monument here in Richmond. But one of those girls is my oldest daughter. And so thinking about policies, even within our dance studio, about dance attire not being uniform, because we all have different shades, is a policy that we have taken on this year. And then also looking at the structures of policies as well. And I see someone's hand is raised. And so here, if you all would like to drop in the chat again, um, let's see, you would like to drop in the chat. What do you think racial trauma might look like within yourself or even your community? And so I'll offer one that's very was very personal for me as a student. I was in elementary school, normally the only Black student in my classroom, so that was traumatic for me. Being fearful of children who stay quiet, mistrust of institutions like the library that may have tried to change from past practices. Andrew, that's an excellent point as well. And so making sure that all of our public spaces in particular feel inclusive of everyone or inclusive to everyone. And we may just see the tip of the iceberg. We may just see that mistrust or distrust, but not really see all of the things that have happened underneath that. And so some other signs and symptoms might be thinking the worst of yourself or others, being fearful or having anxiety, rarely feeling safe, even being sensitive to touch, loud noises, or strong smells. Again, talking about those high risk behaviors, challenges with problem solving, learning, and memory. Remember, we talked about our brain growing from bottom to top. And so the top would be where we had those problem solving skills. And so not being able to access those things. Being at a traffic stop and carefully looking to see the color of an individual. That's true. And I can tell you my experiences with the police have largely been pleasant. I grew up in Glen Allen, Virginia, though. My husband, who's from Baltimore, has a very different perception of police. And so immediately, if he gets stopped, his palms start sweating, his heart starts racing. You start to see those PTSD-like behaviors emerge. Adults who avoid those who are different from themselves. Those are really great responses. And so again, that bottom part, that limbic system or survival part of our brain tends to respond in one of three, possibly four ways. I've seen different articles and different things that has added Fawn to this response. So I put it there in parentheses. But a person who has experienced stress is probably going to have a heightened stress response, right? And so they may not even be aware or conscious of what is even happening. And so using the example of getting stopped by the police, right? Your body is flooded with hormones, primarily adrenaline and cortisol. Your heartbeat starts to increase, your breathing starts to increase. You're scanning the room because your brain is saying, hey, I'm not safe, right? Your limbic system is in high gear, right? And so it takes time to come down from that. Like you're not going to immediately get the ticket from the police officer and just immediately feel safe, right? It's going to take a while to feel like your normal self from that experience, and you may not even recognize what is happening or what has happened or what even triggered you to feel that way. So when we think about fight, that's housed in our sympathetic nervous system, right? So it's irritability, anger, aggression, moving toward someone, can be anxiety there a little bit too. I know that for me, if I feel anxious, I will sometimes also feel angry. And so also within that sympathetic nervous system would be running away or panicking, avoiding the situation altogether. And so I'm no longer going to go in the store where people are following me, or I'm not going to raise my hand again because my teacher has embarrassed me. And so avoiding situations that way. Um, Freeze, so being stuck, spacing out, disassociating, not speaking at all. And then Fawn, that new response that is floating around, is really being people pleasing to avoid conflict. And so saying yes, even when you don't really want to, because you have a hard time setting boundaries. That's another trauma response. Again, we talked about being responsive with policies and procedures, responding to our downstairs brain. So doing things like breathwork activity that we did in the very beginning to just give us some time to reset. And we'll talk in this next half about some other things to do that to be able to access that upstairs part of our brain. Acknowledging how someone feels, but being low and slow, so not standing over top of them while if you're working with young people, especially not standing over top of them, but really with anyone, I guess. Removing threats and triggers. And so if you are the person who's triggering me, maybe you stepping away, Andrew, and allowing Emily to take over, right? And so my weather is going to become her weather. And so I'm something has triggered me or made me think about something that may have happened, and you're yelling at me. It's just really elevating instead of de-escalating. Engaging that left and right side of your brain, and we'll do a really fun brain breathing activity at the very end where that's concerned. And then anytime you can offer sensory things like or blankets or a cool down area. Some spaces have mindfulness rooms. you really want to address that survival brain, but connect to that person's emotional brain so that they can also access their thinking brain. So thinking about, instead of like, well, what is wrong with him? Why would he do that? Thinking about what has happened and what might that person or group's experiences be. All right. So we'll stop right here for questions about that first part, and then we'll jump into strategies. So if you want to unmute yourselves, that would be great, rather than going into the chat. And we'll take maybe 5 minutes or so, 3 to 5 minutes for questions.
Amanda,
Mhm.
my wife is a teacher. Now, particularly in the age of COVID, they have just gone back to school. But under so-called normal times, one of the disciplinary techniques that teachers are often, or not disciplinary, classroom control techniques
Mhm.
that teachers are taught to use is that sort of physical presence,
Mhm.
being close to students that they think might be disrupting.
Mhm.
Do you think that that is the same thing as what you talked about, looming over someone who might be um, experiencing something that the teacher doesn't know anything about, that's quite kind of re-traumatizing?
I do, and I've done that as a classroom teacher. Like I said, I was a teacher, or at least worked in the school system in some capacity for almost 20 years. And so I'm very familiar with that strategy, with quietly walking over and just standing by the students to let them know that you're there, and, sort of offering a nonverbal um, redirection. I think you really have to know your students. And so through relationship, which we'll talk about, relationship is always going to trump ACEs. It's always going to trump trauma. So if a student has a relationship with you already, I don't think that may be a perceived or imagined threat. But if I was talking in the library and you came and stood beside me as, the librarian, or someone I might not be as familiar with, I don't know that I would perceive it that way. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's always context.
Yeah. So I think, that may be more triggering, because now I'm wondering, who's this man? Why is he standing here? And so now I'm sort of like wondering if I'm safe, or, versus, a teacher who I have that relationship with.
Well, and I think, I mean, again, you as a classroom teacher, know it's going to be very difficult after a year away, for teachers and students to reestablish that relationship.
Yeah.
And so something that you might be considering for your practice.
It's going to take a lot of work. We've officially been out almost a year, coming up on 2 weeks. And so even within the Boys and Girls Clubs, and having those relationships with our kids. And so we don't know what people have experienced, whether it's food insecurity or abuse, or, do we have any other questions before we jump into the toolkit portion? All right, so really thinking about self-healing. For me, setting boundaries is self-care, right? And so if you have experienced any type of trauma, whether it's racism or anything else that may or may not be on that ACE questionnaire, just understanding that self-care really starts with setting boundaries, right? And so there is a causal effect between poverty and trauma, and those who experience it. Brain research also suggests that those things are toxic to the developing brain, similar to the impact of alcohol and drugs, right? So whether it's from microaggressions to, just outward racism, they can all be damaging to one's self-esteem. And it can be, again, real or your perception. When my daughter was in third grade, She goes to a predominantly white private school. There were times where girls would come up to her hair and pull on it and ask her, is this your real hair? Not understanding that those were microaggressions. And so having to even have those kinds of conversations with young people is very important. I saw something, I think, on Facebook that said if students, Black and brown students, um, can experience racism, then white students can certainly talk about being anti-racist. And you can't be trauma informed without truly being anti-racist. And so just exploring what that oppression, harassment, and racial trauma can do within the body and how it impacts those who experience it is, I think, is the first step. Um, for those of you who may consider yourself to be an ally in being anti-racist. This is another little video about resilience, and we will watch this because it's short.
Today, we're going to talk about a word. The word is resilience. Resilience is a word that most of us have heard, but some don't understand. Resilience is like a tree in the wind. When the wind blows, it bends and then adapts by coming back to center. With people, it's adapting to a traumatic experience, or coming to terms with the experience. When we're young, we have shocking experiences, like being startled by a neighbor's barking dog, or a scary movie that gives us nightmares.
I'm sorry, I skipped that. Someone was saying that they couldn't see the video? Were the rest of you able to see that?
Yes, I was.
Okay.
When we're young, we have shocking experiences, like being startled by a neighbor's barking dog, or a scary movie that gives us nightmares. Maybe that overwhelming first day of school. These are scary things that can cause us much fear. Most of us learn to adapt or come to terms with them. So we all learn resilience at a young age. Everyone is resilient to some degree, but as we experience more serious things, we can have a harder time adjusting. A traumatic experience, like abuse, violence, or even something like rape. Experiences like these can stop you in your tracks. You can't adapt like you did with less severe traumas. These are life experiences that shock you to your core, and you become caught up in them and can't shake them. You simply can't adapt or easily come to terms with them. When we experience trauma like that, there are many people that can help. We are young, our parents, brothers and sisters, friends, and teachers. But when we experience major trauma, we might need help from a counselor or even a doctor. Doctors that help people with adapting to life after a traumatic experience are called psychologists. But those aren't the only ones that can help. A whole community can provide help, especially if your community is a trauma-informed community. So when you hear the word resilience, you can think about adapting or getting back to center. And learning to adapt to traumatic experiences over time can help you become even more resilient. Here are a few strategies to help you cope with trauma and help you get back the ability to recover. 1. Establish an attachment to a caring adult. 2. Learn the ability to calm oneself. 3. Gain a sense of belonging. We have 42 strategies to help you build resilience. Find out more about these 42 strategies by visiting resiliencetrumsaces.org.
And so if you go to that website, they have a deck of almost like playing cards that has different strategies that you can use. And I know that we've used them at work. When we come in, we might have a card on the desk back in the good old days when we were working in person, but we also use them with kids most certainly, and they don't cost a lot. So I wanted you to just see that as well as an additional resource. And so with growing our resilience, with trying to find things to put into our toolkit when we're dealing with racial trauma, but also with, these things could be applicable to any type of trauma as well. I always recommend, especially right now while most of us are working while home, to designate certain spaces and times for eating, sleeping, working, and playing. So I'm sitting in what is my yoga Zen den room. Prior to COVID, this was not a working space. And so I've had to create like a little corner for myself in our den that has like, some of my favorite things like coloring books or a blanket or things like that. So it's separate from a working area. We also are trying to be better about eating at the table. And so instead of eating on the couch while we watch TV, and so setting those types of physical boundaries are very important. Also, giving yourself lots of self forgiveness and self compassion. There's some other things that are linked here that are tips and ideas for working from home for yourself, agency teams, home with kids, but also really discussing how you need support if you find that you are feeling inundated, and it hasn't been so much for me over the past few weeks because I've sort of unplugged, but if you are feeling inundated with the news or with work or with, all of the things, really voicing that to colleagues, but also setting a boundary and saying no. I like to say that if saying yes to you means saying no to me, then that has to be a no for me, right? And so just setting that boundary there, that little sign that I have in the corner, I have hanging on my door. Sometimes it works for my girls, and the middle one can read, and sometimes she'll move the magnet to come on in. So just figuring out what works best for you, your organization, family, and community in terms of setting those physical and emotional boundaries is very important for self-healing practices. Also, taking breaks. And so, a few months ago, I think probably between November and January, I was watching like all of the news stations, like all of them. I would have one on in my room. I would have one on in the living room. I was getting news alerts. Like I just, wanted to have every perspective, and I had to take a break from all of that. I have not watched the news since the middle of January, except for like, if someone I knew was going to be on the news or there was a story I really wanted to catch. But I really needed to take a break from that because it was impacting my mental health. Same thing with last summer. Really taking a break from some of the stories that I was seeing as it related to the Black Lives Matter movement or marches. I really needed to disconnect from, right? So being able to take breaks from things, but also getting up and moving your body. So before COVID, I was getting 15 to 20,000 steps a day. Now I'm probably getting 3,000. And so it's cold outside. I'll make an excuse for not wanting to go outside and take a walk, but like really trying to embed those things in your day because they're very helpful to activate that parasympathetic part of your nervous system or that rest and reset, rest and digest part of your nervous system. Brain breaks, you can Google a million activities that you as an adult can do for brain breaks, or that you can pull into the library or whatever workspace that you might have, that you can also just embed into your day, which also helps not to just reduce that toxic stress that might come from racism or any of those other indicators, but also allows you to be more productive and just an overall happier person. When we talk about movement breaks again, just taking a stretch or a walk, literally jumping and just shaking it out, or sitting in your chair. If you are like me and your knees are a little questionable sometimes, just sitting and shaking is also movement that you can just do right at your desk. Again, balancing that right and left side of your brain. So you see the little young person here crossing his midline, but we'll do a breath work activity that does that same thing. Coloring, we're going to do alternate nostril breathing, grounding to the present, and doing these things when you're not feeling the effects of toxic stress will allow you to draw upon them when you are. And so if using the example of getting stopped by the police, feel anxious in that moment, that's not the time to start doing a grounding technique, right? These are things that you want to practice for 2, 3, up to 10 minutes a day. I teach a 45-minute meditation class in person on Sundays, that's a really long time. And I wouldn't suggest trying to force yourself to do something like that. Just taking, a meal even and being mindful, or a mindful walk. What mindful eating and mindful walking look like. If I'm going out for a walk, I'm going to set an intention to look. For me, it's always looking for birds or looking for flowers, right? But being very intentional about that, noticing my breath, how I feel in my body, journaling. So if something has happened, if, perhaps someone has followed me in a store, writing about that experience and thinking about what I felt like and where I was holding that in my body, is another thing that I do. Talking it out with friends, your community, a therapist. I'm the only non-clinician on my team, which is really helpful for me because when I'm stressed out, I know that I can text a colleague and they're going to give me their professional and personal advice. Eliana Gill, you can Google, just wipe it off. Um, Strategy that she uses where you're literally just wiping off, almost like tapping, but instead of tapping, you're wiping those things that have happened, and things that can engage your five senses. So something that I used to do when I worked out in the world was take cotton balls and put different scents on them. So it might be vanilla extract, it might be lavender from my essential oils, and I kept them in Ziploc bags. And so I would sometimes have kids who were even staff who had been triggered by something that happened, and they would grab a bag with a cotton ball. They would smell the scent. We would talk about what the smell was. Did it make them think about anything, or was there a memory they associated with that? And that was a nice way to help them to be able to regulate, self-regulate. So that's another self-healing strategy that I really like. Because I'm at home, when I'm sitting in this space, you can probably see behind me, I normally have candles of different scents. And so right now it smells like lemonade and lavender in here. And so being able to have those kinds of things around me, I find to be very helpful. Again, taking a break from social media, the news, screens, taking a sick day or personal day when you need one. Because we work from home, I have been very apprehensive about taking sick days or personal days because I'm already home. But I'm still working. And so like being able to like separate myself from that. I was really great this week. I took off for 3 days because I got in a car accident last week and I didn't say I'll just power through like I normally do. And so giving yourself permission to even take a break from work is something that I would consider to be a self-healing strategy. Establishing a routine where there's some predictability in place. We talked about that work and play zone. Really making time for yourself. And if you have kids or pets or you're caring for anyone else during your day, making time for them that's also separate from you, but also prioritizing self-care and self-compassion. And so not allowing those things to be like on the back burner. So I also have a 22-year-old son, and my youngest child is 4. And so I was a much different parent with him than I am with my younger girls. Like everything about my son came first. And I've stopped doing that because I was allowing his needs to outweigh my own. And so that's another thing that I would offer for you. Staying connected to others, and again, setting those limits on technology. All of those things will help you to find balance. Scheduling breaks and times for rest. Some days I might schedule a nap from 9 to 10, and that's my lunch break because there's some nights that I don't sleep well because of my 4-year-old. And so being able to schedule those things too. Just really understanding that recovery is possible. If you have had negative impacts from racism or for any of those trauma indicators, just understanding that you have the ability to overcome those things. The most important factor that increases resilience is having a strong relationship with at least one caring and competent adult. And each and every one of us on this call is able to be a positive role model or mentor for someone else, right? Also making sure that the talents of those around us are really nurtured and appreciated, right? Having people feel like they have some control over their life and that you also have a sense of belonging to a community. So if, I'm experiencing this, maybe you also are experiencing it, and that could be a way that we can also connect with one another. You don't have to push that big red ball, up to that peak alone. So again, this goes back to those resilience trumps cases cards. There are lots of different prompts there that will help to grow empathy. Different, I don't know how you want to say it, role playing activities that will also allow those who are using those cards to express their feelings, and giving them some of those tools that they need, or even for yourself, the opportunity to calm yourself, right, or to work through your own self healing. So I would offer you this opportunity to just pick one, and we're not going to do this as a group or anything, but just one intention that you can commit to for this week, whether that's taking an opportunity to be still, or even just showing up for yourself, whether that looks like making a doctor's appointment or reaching out to a therapist, maybe even taking a yoga class, protecting your space. And so again, asking for help and setting those boundaries, making time for self-care. And then again, can't emphasize this one enough, detoxing from the news and social media. I take a silent retreat once a year. It was February of last year, and so we haven't been able to do that this year, but it really allowed for me the opportunity to refocus and refill my own cup. So there's a quick recap. We have time for a couple questions, and then I'll just model for you what that alternate nostril breathing looks like, since we're pushing up against our time. There's some other sources. I really like this one. It's like a wallet card that talks about racial trauma, but also gives like some really nice strategies that you can use when you encounter racism, but it also gives resources. So I link that, of course, here as well. All right, so questions and comments.
Oh, dear.
I just wanted to say, Amanda, I'm working as a volunteer facilitating a group, and it's adults. Some of them are younger than I am, some of them are older than I am. And we've been together for a while, so we haven't had any real traumatic situations. But here again, it's not a diverse group of people. All of us are white. And a couple of times there have been instances where I have felt people were uncomfortable, and just going through what you were actually addressing as much for us to do for ourselves, but to be able to manage those in a group setting, I think will be really valuable to me at some point.
And I think that, and thank you for sharing that, Julie. I think we've all been impacted by racism in very different ways. There's an educator at my daughter's school who, my mom is 70 plus, and this educator is about my mom's age. And she was doing her student teaching during massive resistance when schools closed in Prince Edward County. And the lifelong impact, the trauma that she experienced from that set the groundwork for her commitment to diversity even now, right? And so she and I have been able to have that conversation about why she's so passionate about diversity. And I wouldn't have known that had I not engaged her in, a conversation about some things that my daughter was experiencing that I felt like were microaggressions. And so I think the more that we open up the lines of communication and just take the opportunity to talk to one another, but also hear one another, the better off we'll be as we all work together to overcome historical and racial challenges that still exist in the United States.
Tara Hepworth asked, do you provide small group meditation activities and or sessions that focus on working through these traumas for clients that she and others work with that have likely experienced many of these traumas, including racism, even if they may not recognize that is what causes their responses.
I do. I love meditation. It's next to my family. It's like my first love. And so, yeah, I absolutely do. I'm very passionate about self-healing and restorative practices. I teach restorative yoga outside of COVID, and just recognize even within my own experiences how needed this work is. And so certainly Andrew can provide my contact information for anyone who wants it. It's also listed here as well. And thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you, Dawn. We have just a couple of more minutes if anyone else has any questions. And so with alternate nostril breathing, this is probably the breath work activity I do more often than not, aside from what we did in the beginning, where it's just finding your breath and noticing the natural rhythm of your breath and really starting to just deepen your breath. I will do alternate nostril breathing if I'm driving and I'm feeling anxious in traffic. I will hide from my children and do alternate nostril breathing. You really only need 2 or 3 minutes, I think, to just feel sort of a reset. And so what that looks like, I call this cowabunga hands. I grew up in the 90s. I don't know what it's actually called. So there may be a technical name, but I call it cowabunga hand. And so you're going to take your thumb and plug your right nostril. And you all don't have to demonstrate this unless you're comfortable. And you're going to inhale through your left nostril, really filling up as much as you can. And then you'll plug your left nostril with your pinky and exhale through your right nostril. And so it will look like you're alternating between. So inhaling through the right and exhaling through the left, right? If you have any sinus stuff, allergies, cold, COVID, any upper respiratory stuff going on, you're going to want to get some tissues because that's going to clear out your sinuses and it can get a little messy. But I will tell you that that's like the ultimate reset for me when I don't have time to do like a full, or when I don't make time, I always have time, but I don't make time to do like a full out meditation practice. I'll do alternate nostril breathing. And so I wanted to just offer you that and maybe challenge yourself to set a timer for 2 or 3 minutes, light a candle and see what you feel like. And then in those moments where you're feeling anxious or stressed out, being able to just pull that out of your own toolkit.
I'd not heard of that that method before. I think that's a good way to practice it consciously.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do that probably almost every day. I was driving today and I was like, oh my God, I have to get back home. I have to do this, I have to do that. And I was like, you know what? I need to focus and I'm trying to drive and I really need to calm myself down, so that I'm not distracted while I'm driving. And so, yeah, I've found it to be useful in most any situation. Thank you. I agree. I agree. I just like calling it cowabunga hand. It's The Simpsons.
Thank you so much, Amanda. It is extremely useful. I think for people who tend to take things in and keep them in, this will be a way to help.
Thank you. And
So,
That was really good. That was a really good presentation.
Thank you.
yeah. You can tell you've done this.
I could talk about mindfulness and trauma-informed practices all day. So you guys have a great night.
Thank you so much. You too. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.